Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour, bon après-midi. Bienvenue à cette table ronde consacrée aux relations Chine-États-Unis. Vont-elles être marquées par l'affrontement ou la coopération? Mon nom est Julien Toureil. J'ai le plaisir et le privilège d'être votre modérateur pour l'une de ces dernières séances des MEDays 2024. La relation entre les États-Unis et la Chine est l'un des enjeux les plus significatifs et déterminants de la scène internationale actuelle. La montée en puissance de la Chine dans des domaines tels que la 5G, l'intelligence artificielle ou encore les semi-conducteurs menace directement l'hégémonie technologique américaine. En réponse à cette montée en puissance, Washington tente de dresser des barrières, que ce soit en imposant des restrictions sur les exportations de technologies par des entreprises américaines ou l'interdiction d'importation de technologies chinoises aux États-Unis, ou encore en utilisant les droits de douane comme outil de guerre commerciale. La rivalité entre les deux puissances se fait également sentir sur le plan militaire. La présence renforcée de forces américaines en mer de Chine méridionale et le soutien aux alliés régionaux comme Taïwan renforcent la dynamique de confrontation, tandis que Pékin affirme de plus en plus sa souveraineté sur cette zone stratégique. Si les facteurs de rivalité sont nombreux, il existe toutefois des zones de coopération possibles entre Pékin et Washington, en particulier pour faire face à des réalités globales telles que la lutte contre les changements climatiques, les pandémies ou encore la non-prolifération nucléaire. Cette relation chino-américaine reflète ainsi une dynamique complexe où affrontements et coopération se superposent constamment. Et pour y voir plus clair dans cette relation, nous avons avec nous 5 panélistes distingués, je dis bien 5, vous aurez constaté qu'il en manque peut-être un. Je vais vous les présenter, ces panélistes. Tout d'abord, à ma droite, Anna Ashton, spécialiste des relations États-Unis-Chine, en particulier de la politique économique et commerciale chinoise. Le professeur Yong Won, directeur de l'école d'études internationales à l'université de Pékin. H.E.Mr. Castleberry-Hernandez, ancienne haute fonctionnaire au sein du département d'État américain. Son Excellence Douglas Luth, ancien ambassadeur des Nations Unies auprès de l'OTAN et aujourd'hui président pratique internationale et de défense au BGR Group. Et nous rejoindra dans quelques minutes son Excellence H.E.Mr, ancien président de l'Assemblée générale de l'ONU. So, without further ado, I will start our discussion with maybe quite a sensitive question about a major geopolitical issue in the relationship between Washington and Beijing. In what ways might the geopolitical tensions, especially in the Asia-Pacific region, notably concerning Taiwan, influence the trajectory of US-China relations? We want to break the ice on this question. Mr. Luth.
So I can begin this question about Taiwan as a potential flashpoint in the bilateral relationship. And I think, first, though, I'd like to offer a little more strategic context and actually take an objection to the title of this panel, because it portrays with the word versus, it reflects conflict and opposition. I think it should be the US and China, and which is, of course, a combination, a blend of competition and cooperation. But on the strategic military question, I think actually the war in Ukraine has some important lessons for Chinese leaders. And if there's any value that might be taken from the war in Ukraine, it might be 2 lessons in particular for Chinese leaders. Number one, I think that the Russian army that invaded Ukraine in 2022 was the product of a decade-long investment program by President Vladimir Putin in his army, and resulted in a sense of optimism and confidence that this army could do what it said it could do. And of course, beginning in even the early days of 2022, another army was disclosed, was revealed, not the army that Putin thought he had invested in. I hope President Xi reflects on his investment in his military forces and wonders if maybe the Chinese military, the PLA, is not the PLA that the generals promise. So that's lesson number one. Lesson number two is a lesson in the map, in geography. And notice that Ukraine is an immediate neighbor with only a land border with Russia. Well, by and large, Black Sea, okay, but mostly a land border. They're neighbors, right? And of course, when reflecting on the map in East Asia, there's 100 miles of open sea between mainland China and Taiwan, which means it's a vastly more complicated military challenge than what Putin took on in Ukraine. So if there can be any good news coming out of this tragedy of the war in Ukraine, it might actually be good news in terms of reflection on another potential conflict on the other side of the earth.
Really interesting. Would you want to chip in on that? Maybe Professor Wong or Asha, would you like to add something on that?
I'll just add on. I agree on a bulk of what the former U.S. Ambassador NATO mentioned. One point I do want to underscore is more of a strategic predictability argument, looking into beyond the Biden administration on what would the relationship look like. And I feel like it's still going to have its four aspects, which is cooperation, competition, neutrality, and adversarial context as well. So in terms of going back to the point of Ukraine, beyond the Biden administration, I do believe that there may be some interest in the new U.S. global leadership that we're going to maintain our level of strategy of restraint, where we're not really interested in getting involved in Ukraine war, or potentially in case of an event of a crisis between Taiwan and China, we're not that interested. So there's potentials in that. And why is that so concerning? Well, when you look at while we're in the era of strategic competition, we're seeing more of an alignment, right, between U.S. competitors as well as adversaries, between North Korea, Iran, China, and Russia. So the level of restraint may not be the best calculated move, but in the interest of President Trump, I do see that may play out in some of these crises. Mm-hmm.
Thanks a lot, thanks a lot. Anna, I've seen you nodded on that. Would you like to add something?
Sure. I think a couple of points are worth mentioning in addition to those that have been made. I would agree that, I think that the evidence does not suggest that China's government is currently confident that the military is ready for a successful invasion of Taiwan. Xi Jinping himself has said that he hopes for the military to be ready by 2027, which does not necessarily mean that there's an intention to invade Taiwan in 2027, but it does mean that there is a sense that the military is not ready yet. Also, the language around reunification with Taiwan has remained focused on prioritizing peaceful reunification. That might look more coercive than peaceful, but the stated Chinese goal is to avoid bloodshed if possible. And one of the things that gets talked about a lot as a worry is a possible Chinese blockade of the Taiwan Strait. But it's important to remember that if there were a blockade of the Taiwan Strait, that would constrict all of or most of China's major ports. So it would actually make it difficult for China itself to export its own goods to the rest of the world. So none of these things seem to me like reasons to be very worried that there is an impending conflict here. I think that the main reason to worry about a possible conflict is that the status quo in the US-China relationship around Taiwan has eroded to a certain extent. The idea of strategic ambiguity that the US has long upheld has sort of slipped in the last 8 years. And while technically that remains the American policy, I think there's lots of reason to look at things that have been said by President Biden and question whether this is really ambiguous anymore. And because of that, we've seen that the Chinese military has responded with more exercises, more shows of force in the Taiwan Strait. And whenever there are live fire military exercises and other, an opposing military presence in the same region, of course, there's the possibility of an incident or accident that could spiral out of control. So the most important thing that the two countries can do right now is maintain clear communication between their militaries.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, that's exactly the point I wanted to highlight, that there's always the chance of a deliberate military action, but there's also a concerning chance of a miscalculation or an accidental triggering of a conflict. And in this way, now, as the Biden administration departs, it has, at least for about a year now, established several layers of communications, bilateral communications among military leaders. And this is an important preventive measure to prevent the prospect that a miscalculation or accident sort of takes over and leads us someplace we don't wish to go.
Welcome, Mr. H.E.Mr. Nice to have you with us.
I apologize. I was in a plenary session that ran over time. They didn't want to let me leave. I apologize.
We understand, no problem. I will give a chance to Professor Wang to address the issue. Do you believe that the Chinese leadership has learned the right lessons of the tragedy of the Ukraine war?
Yeah, thank you. I think that is a very important topic and a very good discussion. First of all, I appreciate the forum organizers to give us a so important platform to voice our study, voice our views. That is a perfect the place to conduct such a dialogue in this. I appreciate it very much. About Taiwan issues, first of all, I would like to say that is there is no such the timeline or the harsh for the solutions of the Taiwan issues. Yeah, so that is the Western media promoted such an idea. That is 2027, 2022, 28. China will launch the military strike over Taiwan. So I think that is a misperception and misguided. So I think that is the politically intended to use it as the leverage to contain the China's influence. So the number one. Secondly, I think that is such a narrative. That is an interventional approach on the part of the United States. Okay, I think is very questionable. Why? Because the Taiwan, the Taiwan issue, from the constitutions and the laws of the both parties of across the Taiwan Strait. Okay, they are the part of China. There's no doubt about that. Okay, that is be installed in the constitutions of both sides, even on the Taiwan, right? So that is part of China. And also, they recognized by the international organizations, such as the United Nations. right? So to be very clear about that, right? So the intervention approach, I think that is legally questionable. Related to this, right? So to be the practical, right? So that is we share some we acknowledge the concerns about the way of the reunifications. To address such the concerns, in the two meetings between the leaders of the U.S. and China, between President Xi of China, President Biden, China say it very clearly. That China wants the peaceful reunification of the country. China can wait, can be patient, to be very clear about, because that is easily to understood, because the peaceful reunification for the benefits of the Chinese on both sides. But China, has the military modernization. It aims to deter the Taiwanese separatists. Now they are on the stage. They have power. They can someday they want to modify the constitutions to give up the Chinese shape of the Taiwan the status. So that is why China does something. The Chinese leaders have the domestic, support and pressure to maintain the reunification, the sovereignty, the integrity of sovereignty of China. So that such compositions should be well understood by the United States, by Japan or the other countries, international community. Very, very important, right? About the lesson of the Ukraine conflict, very important. I appreciate the points shared by the American colleagues here. Number one, so that nobody will benefit from the war. To Ukraine, people of Ukraine, people of Russia, people of all the Europe suffered. So you will see the tragic results of the war. So we don't want to have it in our region, Asia Pacific. Secondly, and we should be very careful about the influence of that geopolitical politics. So in the Europe, so we should be thinking about the root causes of the Ukraine conflict. That is behind the conflict is the big power competition. Either the special role of the plan of the NATO. Since the 1999, right, we see the Eastern world expansion of NATO, right? So that is to cause the concerns. Well, so we should be, so the NATO members should have a second thought about this. Learn the lesson from it, very important. And that is Ukraine conflict divided Europe, undermining the prosperity and peace. We should be very careful of that. So we learn the lesson from the Ukraine conflict in our regions. We don't, the countries like China, the Southeast Asia's now more be joined by the South Korea. They don't want to pick the sides between China and the United States. We don't be trapped in the big power politics, and Taiwan is some kind of issues that. So I think in China, I said that a lot of people reading in this way.
Thank you. Mr. Lut, and then Mr. Jeremic will ask your insight.
I heard the word NATO, so I thought I had to reply. Look, when the Soviet Union broke apart in 1991, there were 16 members in the alliance, right? And those 16 members have been the same members largely since 1949, right? We went from 12 members in 1949 when NATO was formed to 16 when the Soviet Union broke up. Since then, since 1991, another 16 have joined. In every one of those cases, NATO did not solicit membership. In every one of those cases, national decisions led to an application to join NATO. And so actually, the enlargement of NATO reflects national sovereign decisions by those states. And what caused those states to take that decision? What caused them to choose to march west towards NATO was the experience of having lived under the Soviet Union, right? And what causes Ukraine to aspire to join NATO? It's exactly the same. It's a national decision by Ukrainian people to be safe. And they have good reason to be concerned. So I just want to distinguish, it's difficult to be on the one hand for national sovereignty, which is in the second item in the UN Charter, in the second article of the UN Charter, national sovereignty and territorial integrity. It's difficult to be for that and against member states formerly under the thumb of the Soviet Union choosing to join the alliance of their choice. So there's some history here that's important.
Thanks a lot. Mr. H.E.Mr, you must have noticed that we started add-on with great power rivalry, especially in the geopolitical realm and in Asia-Pacific. As the outsider here on this panel and as a former president of the UN General Assembly, what would be your take on this issue, your perspective on that?
First of all, I want to apologize for being late, but they wouldn't let me off the stage in the plenary. I think this is possibly the most important panel of this whole conference, because I think that the U.S.-China relations are going to be the key parameter in the 21st century of all things from peace and security to technology to economic development, sustainability, prosperity, and so on. And I think that we are in for a possibly a rocky ride in the coming months. I just came from China. I talked to a number of people there. There's a lot of apprehension, a lot of nervousness right now about what is going to come next. I believe that the new administration in Washington is going to start off with an opening salvo, and there's going to be a counter to that salvo, I'm sure. But then I am perhaps more than average optimistic when it comes to what can come out of this whole thing, and I think it is not inconceivable that there is going to be a reset and some kind of new understanding, perhaps at a different price, if you will, when it comes to discussions of trade and economy. But I think it is not inconceivable that things will not deteriorate. The Chinese side was, I think, very clear in drawing the four red lines, the four boundaries, as to how they see the starting of the conversation. And I think that there are people in the new administration that are interested in, making sure that there is no catastrophic decoupling or like any dramatic changes. And Elon Musk is perhaps just one of them, but not the only person, I'd say, in the new circle of trust of the new president that might play a role there. But when it comes to the big picture stuff, I'm actually teaching, now I'm a professor at Sciences Po, Paris School of International Affairs, and I give a class on Introduction to Contemporary Geopolitics, and I'm trying to be very practical about things. I'm trying to share my experiences from being foreign minister and being president of the General Assembly, so I'm essentially giving a practitioner's class. But on one part of the class, and the part is on China, I actually try and dive a bit more into history. because I think it is absolutely essential to understand Chinese history and Chinese culture in order to be able to deal with China pragmatically, factually, in a I'd say, useful way. For China, it has always been about rejuvenation and reunification. This is just the last episode of China's rejuvenation and reincarnation, because it's very mythical and tied to the very existence of China's notion of itself. China, perhaps not too many people know, has no notion of a beginning. I mean, unlike us. I mean, there is a notion of a beginning, of a country, of a kingdom, and it's usually cherished, be it like at the beginning of the Republic, conception of the kingdom and of whatnot. China has no beginning. Chinese first yellow emperor became a mythical and a heroic figure in history because he reunited China, and that was 5,000 years ago. And this concept of rejuvenation and reunification is something that drives that drove every single dynasty that ruled China. And one can argue that the CPC is, as a matter of fact, just another dynasty ruling this. It's not a state. I think it's not an ethnic state. It's not a nation state. It's a civilization state. Why am I saying this? Taiwan issue is of paramount significance, not just politically, but in so many more deeper ways. I think it would be very, very good if people could take this into consideration as we move forward and discuss future of trade, future of economy, of course, the future of human rights and peace and stability. But the concept of reunification, and that in this generation means the one China policy with regard to Taiwan, is of enormous significance to the Chinese side, and that should not be discounted, except at our own peril.
Thank you very much for enlarging our perspective on this issue. For my second question, I propose that we move to another side of the rivalry between Beijing and Washington, the side of trade, economic, soft power competition, especially in Africa and Latin America. How could China's increasing influence in both regions, Africa and Latin America, reshape its relationship with the United States? Is it another field of rivalry for soft power and economic hegemony that takes place in those specific regions between the two countries? We would like to go first, maybe Asha, on this issue.
Well, if we're going to talk about competition, I would say that in both in Africa and Latin America, in order for the United States to be a competitive force in those regions, it's important to note that policy results show up in a level of policy consistency. There has been this up and down in terms of how much we invest in Africa and Latin America, depending on the administration, right? We saw a lot of that under the Bush administration, and then fast forward to Biden administration, we tried to reinvigorate our investments after we hosted our historic African Leadership Summit, where Vice President Harris subsequently went to critical areas like Ghana and Tanzania and other countries to show support and work closely on cooperative programs involving countering CV, supporting tech startups, supporting food security, and also renewable energy projects. So we haven't done that in a long time, right? But it's good that the Biden administration showed up. I mean, restarted a lot of these new programs. It's just a matter of beyond now this administration, will that continue? If not, the gap is going to continue to widen in terms of how much China is invested in Africa versus the United States. And the same thing in Latin America too, right? There has to be a level of consistency, mainly in soft power, as far as showing up and be able to really effectively compete.
Thank you. Anna, would you want to add something?
I'd be happy to add. I think the way you framed the question was how might Chinese activities, U.S. activities in Africa and Latin America reshape relations between China and the U.S. And I think we should step back a little bit more and think about how is the global order being reshaped by, this increase in Chinese activities around the world, in Africa and Latin America certainly, but not exclusively in Africa and Latin America, and the comparison and contrast between Chinese activities and the legacy of U.S. activities. I think that one of the things that's been coming through very clearly in lots of discussions throughout this week is that the global order is in the middle of a pretty significant shift. And we don't know exactly what it's going to look like when it all settles out, but things are changing. And I think one part of the reason why things are changing is because China has become a much more influential and powerful country and is exerting its influence around the world for its own interests and in pursuit of its own vision. And the US is maybe struggling to respond to that in some ways, but I think this is a difficult moment for everyone because of the fact that there's so much uncertainty, but it's also a moment of opportunity. Because the reality is that no one nation has all of the right answers to the problems that the world faces, and the US and China, although we do actually have some really significant things in common, obviously have some pretty different perspectives from which we're looking at the world and interacting with the world. And I think it's actually to everyone's benefit for there to be more than one significant power on the world stage, and for other nations to have the opportunity to push both of those powers to be more responsive to them.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for this insight and this perspective. Professor Wang, you might like to add something, I guess.
Yes, I'll be very happy to join the discussions on your second question, which is great. First of all, like say, U.S. and China relations are very complicated. I'll just share, I think, your points. Okay, there's no one single word can define the nature of relationship. So that is a combined state of the competition, confrontation, and cooperation. But personally, I'm thinking U.S.-China has the sound reasons, the common interest to work together. And they must work together for the stake of their own and for the benefit of international community. U.S. and China are the major trading partners to each other. Okay, both sides are generated more than the 700 billion US dollars. You think about it, right? Secondly, the two countries are second largest economies, so in the world, about 40% of the GDP. Right, so the two countries, they're not just about competition, a rival to each other. They are the big power, has a special responsibility to the region and to the world. So I think that is, if we pursue the line of the competition too much, we are ignoring our common responsibility for the peace and prosperity of the world. The top challenges for today's world is not who will be number one or number two, right? Engaged in the strategic competition, so-called major power competition. I think that personally, I don't think that is a good idea. US-China should compete for the contribute to the global governance, compete for the providing the public goods on the development, for example, to meeting the goals of United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, right? SDGs. The end development is the top challenge for us of world. Is the most fundamental sources of domestic disorder and international security challenges. We don't need to waste much time on the big power, the competition. But the only one thing should be very careful about that is the military industry complex will benefit from the regional crisis or wars of the conflict. Just some politicians argue that the Ukraine conflict is the most the reasonable or the valuable investment. So that is, make it very publicly, that investment, who will benefit from that? So I think we need for the people's approach to this world, not just for dictated by some big power, but some the old power with old mentality. So I think for the competition, for the problem of the world, the Chinese government comes to three major global governance initiatives. That is the global development. We need universal, that is wide development to tackle the poverty, to tackle the underdevelopment. That is related to too many issues. Secondly, that is global security initiative. We need the countries, all the countries should be included in the dialogue on the security issues. To have should work together to have a say in the security mechanism. That is shared, collective security, not a security of small group of countries. Third, that is a global civilization initiative. When we see all these frictions, tensions, we are in the age of global village. We need to talk to each other, to understand each other better, to respect the civilization of the countries, the values, not just to try to impose one own way, one way of life, and the ideology, on the others. We are in a world of diversity, with different colors. So I think that is challenges of thinking, for way of thinking. I think that is why the Data Forum is very important the venue for us to have a real dialogue on these important issues. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Mr. Lute, you want to add?
As a former American military officer, I take this question in a slightly different perspective, because at face value, you might say, well, for the last 20 years, China has invested, Belt and Road Initiative, critical minerals, the Global South, and the US simply wasn't paying attention, right? And didn't match that investment. It didn't compete in this space, right? But I remember that over the last 20 years, we were doing other things. And we took, in the wake of 9/11 in 2001, critical decisions to to invest elsewhere. And, you know, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are estimated to have cost $3 trillion. $3 trillion. That's $3 trillion that was not going elsewhere, right? The opportunity cost of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan we're only just coming to grips with. At its peak, under President Obama, the war in Afghanistan alone cost $120 billion a year at its peak. Now, China made investment decisions during that 20 years, and so did we. And I think now, as we look back, we can begin to understand better the gives and takes, the puts and takes, the opportunity costs of that common 20-year experience. But the investment profile is vastly different.
Thanks a lot. I may jump to a third and maybe last question because I've just noticed that time goes by very, very fast. Professor Wang, you mentioned, if I'm correct, that as big powers, the US and China have major shared responsibility. We can think about a couple of examples in the domain of technological rapid change like artificial intelligence, in the field of climate change, regarding development. And when I hear you say that, I'm wondering if it's not the time now to move beyond the Thucydides trap logic in the relation. But, and my question is for all of you, obviously, do you think it's time to move beyond this Thucydides trap? And if so, how can concretely Washington and Beijing move beyond that? Maybe Mr. Jeremic, if you want to start.
Thank you. I have to say that I understand very well where Professor Wang's coming from when he talks about these three big initiatives, and I think it's a very valiant, perhaps slightly over romanticized view of international affairs, that it's cooperation and not competition. It would have been like for the first time in history that it is not driven by big power competition, the global discourse, and maybe we're that lucky, but I wouldn't bet all my wealth on that particular scenario. I think it is going to be competition, and whether this is going to be Thucydides trap destined competition is a different matter, and I think one can avoid it. In very short reply to the previous question, China's presence in Africa and China's presence in Latin America, there's this like a famous comment by an African president comparing what's the difference between like a Western delegation coming to the capital and the Chinese delegation coming to the capital. They say, well, the former, they give me a lecture. The other guys, they give me an airport. It's like a succinct way of describing the difference from a perspective of an African country. I mean, I come from a country, from Serbia, that has exceptionally strong relation with China, and it's difficult for me to compare the history of relation with the West that Serbia had in the past with the history of relations with China. I think that China is perceived as a more of a partner and supporter of Serbia than the West. But I think that when it comes to this issue of engagement versus conflict, I think that technology is going to play a key factor, because I think that technology is the ultimate amplifier of productivity, and it's the direction in which one would need to look at in order to resolve the economic troubles and to make sure that there's growth and prosperity in the future. Now, this is what I believe could be the place where a difference can be made, where like I can imagine good scenario and bad scenario, right? Right now, when it comes to the two most, I'd say, important technologies, so like families of technologies that are driving productivities in markets and so on. One is AI, the other is sustainability in general. And both are very important, right? I think that when it comes to AI, United States seems to be having like an edge when it comes to that field. And when it comes to sustainability, which is crucial, that technology for transition to green future, right? I think that China has a decisive edge when it comes to that technology. Now, are we going to live in a completely bifurcated world in which there are going to be two dimensions of globalization, in which, you know, China outbeats US and US outbeats China in one and in the other? I think it makes up, being physicist by training, it makes up for a very unstable equilibrium. And even if certain deals are made within this unstable equilibrium, if essentially you go for like having to choose US or Chinese technology when it comes to AI, or US or Chinese technology when it comes to green transition, I think that there are no good solutions in this regard. So I very much hope to be, you know, living the rest of my life and my family and my daughter as well in a little bit of a more stable equilibrium, which would require engagement. Engagement between China and the US first and foremost when it comes to technological, the future of technology. And this is, again, a place where, I don't know, guys like Mr. Musk may play a role in the coming years.
Asha, you would like to add something?
I just want to add on 2 points. So thank you for bringing up the one with the airport versus lecturing. I will tell you, though, as a former Biden-Harris appointee, we have learned our lesson. In fact, we did a lot of listening, underscored listening at the African Leadership Summit twice, and it worked out. So we're listening more under the Biden administration, right? And a lot of nice outcomes came out of it, where we had a bulk of our cabinet visit Africa and secure historic deals. But one thing I want to underscore too as well, that's important to know with this relationship between the United States and China, is that a lot of these security issues that we work on with China is becoming more and more interconnected to where the American people can feel it. Very important to note, as a result of the San Francisco meeting between President Xi and President Biden, one thing that was very important to note is that they both talked about the issue involving border security, our border security, involving migrants coming from China, as well as the fentanyl crisis. And as a result of this, of what are some policy recommendations moving forward, the result was that we have to work together on this. So that, I think, is important as far as to realize in terms of conflict, that's going to be harder to go in that trajectory because of these other issues like climate change or border security issues involving fentanyl crisis that brings us together. So I think that's important to know as we calculate how this relationship is going to look like moving forward.
Thanks a lot. Mr. Root?
Just very quickly. So Graham Allison, of course, at Harvard, coined this phrase, the Thucydides trap, right? And he looked at a number of case studies going back into history, and he concluded that 9 times out of the 12 studies that he looked at, 9 out of 12, when a prominent power, a dominant power, was challenged by a rising power, it led to conflict, right? So what separated the 3 cases that defied the Thucydides trap? And frankly, one of the decisive features was dialogue. The open channels of communication and so forth that reduced the risk of miscalculation, misperceptions, and accident. So there's a way to defy the Thucydides trap, and I believe that a very important element of that is maintaining these open dialogues, especially on the military front.
Thanks a lot. Maybe we have time for one last question. I think a major question with no easy answer, but you will have to give short answers to it. With the second coming of Trump to the White House, is it an opportunity or an obstacle to redefine in a more positive way the US-China relationship? Large question. You have maybe less than 2 minutes each to answer that. So, sorry.
I'll go first. I hope that it will be an opportunity to at least pivot from or continue the pivot that I think the Biden administration has put a lot of effort into starting. You know, the Trump administration, the first time around, got rid of all of the bilateral dialogues, and the idea was that the dialogues had been taking up a lot of time and effort but not accomplishing very much, and they were done with that. It's understandable from that perspective, but I agree with Doug and others on this panel that the dialogue is critically important. You can't possibly understand each other if you aren't talking to each other. And I know that the Chinese side has taken that position for a long time, and the Biden administration has tried to increase dialogue, and they've done so successfully. I hope that we will see that during the Trump administration. I don't think that there's a guarantee. If we don't see that, you know, I have some hope that in the second Trump administration, President-elect Trump will be less fixated on China as the central cause of US problems and will be more amenable to finding win-win opportunities in the US-China relationship. And I think that that's a possibility because of the emphasis of his rhetoric during the campaigns. It was much less focused on China than was his rhetoric in the 2016 campaign, but it's very difficult to predict exactly what the second Trump administration will look like. It could be just as aggressive and just as polarizing in terms of engagement with China as it was the first time around. And if that is the case, then we will have to figure out how to navigate that. And I think a lot of the responsibility will fall to China.
Thank you.
Yeah, the whole world is watching the U.S. Okay, what the policy of the second term of the Mr. Trump looks like. I would like to see that nobody know. Okay, that is high uncertainties and high predictabilities of there, right? So but personally, I think there is some challenges and opportunities for U.S. and China to work together, the making deal. Right? So China is only the part of the Trump agenda for the second term. Yeah. So the government, U.S. administration will be very busy. First of all, dealing with the domestic politics, political divisions, right? The blue states, the liberals. So that is infighting, domestic infighting there. Secondly, that is in international policy, the Trump administrations will pursue, okay, the American first approach. Okay, that will cause, you know, there might tension and problems with the many countries, including allies. On the sharing of the military expenditure, right, the tariff, etc. Right, so that China is only part of that. Certainly, I think that is the Trump administration, the members, okay, not just one voice. Okay, that is okay. That also the divided as some different opinion. Who will represent the different interests. The U.S. is still diversified, right? Some people in the government might for be more the moderate. Okay, some people might have the China hawks or the hawks on the everything. right? So I think that is something. So I think, but I do believe U.S.-China had the reasons and the strong reasons to work together, right? So I have said that. I'll stop here.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you. Asha, you want to add something? You can go. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, it is a complicated relationship, and moving beyond the Biden administration going to the Trump administration, I think you'll see a mixed bag. But in terms of criticism, I think President Trump will be loud about it, as far as being more assertive towards China, and he'll double down and being very vocal about why they continue to impose tariffs. Why am I going after the situation involving the what's it called, the financial digital currency? We're gonna have a new envoy for that, so there's gonna be some fighting there too. So I do agree with that. Another important point to note is exactly what the panelists here said in terms of soft power. I think there's gonna be a lack of investment in the Trump administration. As a former State Department employee under the Trump administration, we were missing in a lot of soft power, open dialogue forums like this, to where there was a lack of U.S. global leadership. And I see that there was a divestment. So coming in after the Trump administration, there was a lot of recovery in terms of restoring U.S. global leadership and in these very important critical forums that we need to be present and helping to shape decisions. So I think definitely below the Secretary of State, I think you're gonna see a lack of that, because that's what happened during the Trump administration. And then also in terms of some little critical issues like combating climate changes and other soft issues, I think you'll see a lack of that too as well, lack of interest. You won't see like what you saw under the Biden administration, where we had Secretary of State John Kerry as a special envoy in combating climate changes and traveling around securing renewable energy deals. So you'll see some policy continuity, but major policy changes. Thank you.
I think the single characteristic of Trump 2 will be very much like Trump 1, and that is 4 years of unpredictability. He is a leader who values unpredictability because he sees it as a way to garner power for himself. He does this not only with regard to external players, opponents and allies and partners, but he does it internally as well. He generates disputes by way of unpredictability in order to be the man. And I probably tell where I stand on the political spectrum, but that's his leadership style. And a man who's 78 years old is not going to change his leadership style.
Thank you. Mr. Jeremy, would you like to have the last word on that? A quick word.
Look, I think that there's a lot of hope that this change in America is going to get us in a better place, and I completely understand, everything that other participants said here, but I think that around the world, I'm talking about Global South, I'd say in particular, there's like a sentiment that things were somehow not going in the right direction. So, and this is change. So people say, okay, well, let's hope that this change is going to bring some better development. So in most places that I go, and I do travel a lot these days, people are hopeful that Trump is going to bring with him a better situation than what we used to have in the past. Now this may prove to be very wrong. I mean, I agree that he's not the easiest person to predict, has not been the easiest person to predict so far, but right now I think he's still enjoying the honeymoon when it comes to the global public opinion, especially in the global Global South.
Thank you, Mr. Juremic. It feels good to end this conversation on a positive and optimistic note. As a teacher of U.S. foreign policy and international relations, sometimes I feel tired or even bored talking about U.S.-China relations. But our panelists convinced me in the short hour we had together that it's still one of the most stimulating, essential discussion we should have to understand the world we live in and the world we will be living in the next decades or so. So in that regard, I would like you to join me thanking our distinguished panelists for this very stimulating session. Thank you. Et merci à toutes et à tous pour votre attention. Bonne fin de MEDays 2024. À très bientôt.